So it looks like we are live now onto Facebook. I can get the ball rolling with some questions that we have been sent in or are frequently asked on our page. So one question that's always asked is, does the Arboretum use pesticides on the grounds?
Yes, I guess I can say very, very limited capacity. I can't even think the last time we did use it. We're not officially certified as organic, but we've been using organic practices for decades here. There is the odd time where we have used some herbicides on really aggressive invasive plants. So things that we absolutely don't want, the genie out of the bottle to get loose into the Arboretum. And that's in a very, very careful way. So it's kind of part of what we call integrated pest management kind of process where we're doing various control methods and then using very small amounts to try to, completely eliminate those types of invasive plants. But basically, the 400 acres, all the trees, the plants, and everything else, insects, and you'll see spots on leaves, you'll see funguses, you'll see bacteria and everything else. And we kind of let nature take its course and find its balance. There's the odd time we'll use cultural measures to try to help eliminate some really aggressive pests, but really we're probably 99% pesticide free. Even in our nursery, we don't use any of them. We use organic compost that we produce on our site as a fertilizer for most of what we do. So it's kind of something we've set up that way for many years, and it works. Because if you keep things biodiverse and you have that natural genetic diversity buffer and that biodiversity buffer, nature does a pretty good job of finding a balance.
Awesome. Another question we get asked a lot is if you visited the grounds and you walk out towards the nature center, by the nature center, there's that big open field with a structure that's put up in the middle of that field. What is that structure for?
So that structure is actually supposed to be a barn swallow nesting structure. So barn swallows, which have been a common species in Ontario forever, like most of us old folks can remember. We used to have barn swallows. They would nest on your light standers outside your front door. They would be, barns would be literally full of barn swallow nests. Their numbers have dropped significantly in the last 2 to 3 decades, along with a lot of other aerial insectivores. So lots of birds that eat insects that fly, such as swallows or whippoorwills or common nighthawks. Their numbers have dropped a lot in the last few decades. Likely that they can't be sure of the exact cause, but it likely has to do with pesticide use. But those structures were built so that barn swallows had places to nest. Unfortunately, now I don't know what the official word is, but I personally have never seen a barn swallow use one. You'll see smaller ones along 401, for example, and I've never seen a barn swallow sitting on the edge of one. So I don't know how well they've actually worked. But other birds, we've had robins and eastern phoebes nest inside them, and lots of different wasps like using them too. So yeah, but that's what that structure is there for, to try and attract barn swallows, because they are a threatened species in Canada now. So yeah.
And it looks like we have a question in the comments. There is a group of trees on the trail between the main parking lot and the butterfly gardens, near where another trail intersects to go up to the field. The trees are leaning over the trail. Wondering if there are hop trees.
They are, yeah. There's a number of different species on that trail heading towards the Gosling Wildlife Gardens from the parking lot, but certainly those ones definitely stand out. They do lean a little bit. They historically were kind of more bushy, but there was some Manitoba maples that were growing from the edge of the woods that were kind of growing over top of them, which made them lean towards the path. And those trees have since been pruned back. And actually the hop trees are now starting to shoot up a little bit more straight from the center, but absolutely. Tilia trifoliata is what you've been seeing.
Yeah, and they're actually a really good spot because they sort of lean over. when you go by, it's a good time, especially this time of the year, to see if you can find a giant swallowtail caterpillar. So hop trees are one of the food plants for giant swallowtails, and that's our best spot for looking for giant swallowtail caterpillars. So they're kind of a neat caterpillar because they look like bird poop. So if you see a caterpillar crawling around on the hop tree leaves that looks like bird poop, then yeah, probably a giant swallowtail, which interestingly enough is called the orange dog in the States, because that caterpillar is a pest of oranges. And that's, oranges are actually a close relation to hop trees. So the giant swallowtail will eat orange trees as well as hop trees, and prickly ash too.
Another question from the chat is, some time ago, you started the program picking up the pawpaws to create a living gene bank of Ontario Gene Bank. Which species currently does that consist of? Does that include the large Magnolia acuminatas? I'm sorry for that poor pronunciation.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Magnolia acuminatas, those are commonly called cucumber trees, and they were the first species in Canada to be classified as endangered. So yes, our Picking Up the Pawpaws program is actually active, ongoing always. So it's a long-term genetic repository for rare woody plant species here in Ontario. And we try to capture genetics from different populations across the province. So in some cases, they're so rare, there's only one small population. In others, there's kind of pockets, mostly through the Carolinian zone of southwestern Ontario, but also there's a few species that are in eastern Ontario as well. And as far as which ones are in them, there's quite a few. So we have some set up in seed orchards. So those are basically kind of capturing a lot of related individuals from different parts of the province so that they can share pollen with each other, and we can obviously keep them as a gene bank, but also use them to distribute seed for people using them for restoration projects in Ontario. And then a number of other species that either are so limited that they can't warrant having an entire seed orchard, or they're shrubby or things that really we'd want to incorporate into plant collections or gardens. Those would be part of our gene banks, and that we have made sure that we are propagating them from populations in Ontario, so Ontario provenances. But we are tracking all of that information in our database here, so that for researchers or conservation practitioners, they know that the species are backed up here at the Arboretum. And I could go through a big list. There's actually over 30 if we include everything that's kind of gene banked in our plant collections and gardens, as well as what we have in our seed orchards. But some of the main ones are pawpaws, blue ash, cucumber trees, tulip trees, Kentucky coffee trees, and chinkapin oaks and cherry birches. And the ones that you might be referring to, the large Magnolia acuminatas, are likely the ones in our World of Trees collection, which have a plaque in front of them that says, "Be aware, they're rare." And as you travel through that World of Trees collection, you'll see a lot of those "Be aware of the rare" plaques in front of species that are rare in Ontario. And those are kind of generally there for the public to be able to see them and witness these trees. And then we usually have a lot of those species backed up elsewhere in less publicly visible spots as well. So we do have a cucumber tree seed orchard that is separate from some of those ones that are in the collections.
Awesome. We did have a few people join us just now, especially on Facebook. So I'll remind you guys, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, or if you're joining us on Facebook, comment on our video and we can answer those. Another commonly asked question that we get, especially this year, is what does the Arb do to control Lymantria dispar populations?
So okay, Chris has got it. I didn't hear that well, but Chris, if you've got it, you heard it, so great.
Yeah, so, and then Sean can comment because he'll know maybe some more details about it. But so the question is about what was formerly known as gypsy moth caterpillars, but they now are called LDD caterpillars, which is really a dumb name. So so we've gone from an inappropriate name to a dumb name, but supposedly just so people know, the American Entomological Society is working on a new name for them, which will be hopefully great once we find out what it is. But yeah, this year has been a really bad year for those moth caterpillars. They've defoliated lots of trees in many parts of the province. So I was visiting North Bay a couple of weeks ago and got into an oak forest on a rocky ridge, and the entire forest was leafless. There were no leaves at all, so even way up there. In the Arboretum, we haven't done any spraying, I don't believe. Is that correct, Sean? Have we
No
done
spraying.
No spraying. Typically, what happens with these moth caterpillars is there are sort of 2 years that are really bad, and then the population tends to drop again. They never completely disappear, but we don't have sort of epidemic proportions like we have the last 2 years. So I personally am hoping that this is the last year, and then they'll drop off again for another couple decades, and then they'll probably pop up again. But yeah, when there are different management practices for them, including a spray, but it has to be done at sort of exactly the right time and the right age at the caterpillars for it to work. And a lot of people are sort of spraying because they want to spray, but not necessarily spraying at the right stage for that to work. So yeah, at the Arboretum, we just hope for the best and try and let nature sort of take over. We have had sightings of black-billed cuckoos with breeding behavior in the Arboretum this year, and black-billed cuckoos are a major predator on these moths. We also have organized staff work parties where we went around as a staff and picked as many caterpillars as we could. So probably not a huge dent into the population, but it makes you feel good when you can get rid of a whole bunch. So Sean, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the one positive is that again, nature finding a balance. Sometimes when you let things run their course, we're seeing a heavy viral load that's actually impacting a lot of the caterpillars. So there's been a lot of deaths of caterpillars before they reach the stage of becoming moths and producing more for next year. So I'm anticipating, from what I've been seeing, that the population, as Chris said, is going to kind of start on the downswing now, which is good. And as Chris mentioned, what we have typically tried to do is any trees that are really sensitive. So often are smaller trees where we can do manual picking and really try to protect them as they're getting established. We try to prioritize that. Some of the really large trees, there's not a whole lot you can do unless you do spraying, and even spraying is tricky unless you have a helicopter and it's quite expensive. Some people you'll see will put bands around the trees, so burlap bands with kind of sticky material on it, which was meant to trap the female moths as they're climbing the trees. So that is one thing you can use to control them laying eggs in your tree again for next year, especially if it's the one tree in your yard that you really can spend time getting those things on. So if we were seeing the populations, there's figures that they're going to increase again even further next year. Again, we would certainly have had to look into that a little bit for some larger trees too. But we're hoping we've seen the worst of it, and that everything's going to have a chance to recover a little bit next year, even though there's still definitely going to be feeding early on. So
fingers crossed.
Mm-hmm.
Those were kind of my frequently asked questions. So I will again invite you guys all to pop any of your own questions into the chat. Maybe unmute yourself if that's what works best for you. This event is made to facilitate any questions you guys might have, so we're happy to answer anything you guys might be wondering about. So another question from the chat is, how many plant species are there in total at the Arboretum?
Oh, that's a tricky one. If we're doing all plants, we probably still don't officially have that full list. There's obviously a lot of things in our nature reserves. There's mosses, there's sedges, and all sorts of things. So we do have a tally we always add to that. In our collections, it's always varying because we're propagating new things in our nurseries, and there's some things that we do editing in our collections, but we always hover around the 2,000 mark of different taxa. So those would be species and varieties and cultivars, and that's of woody plants specifically. And that's where we really focus our database inventory work. Now, if we include every different perennial in the gardens and annuals that you'll see popping up and weeds in the ditches, it's much bigger than that. And I don't know, Chris, if you have a general number of kind of spontaneous nature reserve plant species, but that's always an evolution for us. We're working on that still. So
yeah, no, so what we do is we keep a bio inventory And during that bioinventory, we have, or on that bioinventory, we just keep adding species to it. So on that list, we have, yeah, the woody plants and the herbaceous plants, including ferns. So sometimes what happens is we'll get like an expert that comes in to do a study on something, and so then they submit a huge list to us of the plants that they found, or especially if it's something that we may not know about. So for example, lichens, we had a lichenologist, a biologist who studies lichens here for quite a while as he did his graduate degrees. He's now the national lichenologist in Ottawa, which is pretty great. And so while he was here, he added like 100 lichens to our list just in the Arboretum alone, including a brand new species that was not found anywhere else in the world. It was discovered in the Arboretum. It was a brand new species. It has now been discovered in other places in Canada. But yeah, so it's a pretty great thing to have a site where, because of the expertise at the University of Guelph, we can also get new species that are found here. So kind of a cool thing.
Another question from the chat is, someone says, last week I saw a toadstool that was yellowish growing on a wood chip covered path. I've never seen one. Is this unusual?
Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, so we have, so I have noticed that because of all the rain that we've had this year, that a lot of fungi that I wouldn't really expect to see until September, I have seen a few sort of popping up already now. They're probably just taking advantage of the fact that there's all this moisture, and that's good for them for making fruity bodies. So there are hundreds of little yellow mushrooms. So not really sure which one it is, but yeah, I think because it's been such a wet summer, we're going to probably see some mushrooms fruiting early, as well as hopefully seeing quite a good variety of mushrooms, possibly in really good numbers here at the Arboretum too. So we have over 200 fungi species, that like macrofungi, that we have recorded here in the Arboretum, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to add some new ones to the list this year too. A good observation to see that coming up on our pathways. Exciting.
A clarification from an earlier question is, sorry, Sean, did you say trees and shrubs with beware of the rare signs are or are not from Southern Ontario genes?
They are. So in our World of Trees collections, when you see those plaques, they're in front of particular species that are more rare in the province. And those actual individuals are also grown from seeds we collected from Ontario population specifically. So some of these species also grow further south in the US, but we really try to make sure we're preserving these, what we call northern genotypes, ones that are sometimes more cold hardy, even things that we've been able to evaluate through cold hardiness trials. So those are representatives of our broader gene bank project. And again, we have all of those rare species. If they're from Ontario, we always try to make sure they're from Ontario seed sources. And certainly those Southern Ontario genetics are the predominant group of species that we do propagate and cultivate here.
Lovely. And another question from the chat is, follow up on the monkey puzzle tree is native.
No, it's actually native to Chile. So it's a Southern Hemisphere tree. It isn't quite cold hardy here. It's not too far off, but it's not quite cold hardy. They can survive in the Niagara region with some protection, and they do quite well on the west coast around Vancouver and Vancouver Island. You may have seen one in our World of Trees collection, and that actually started out a number of years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago. We had a traveling exhibit called Vanishing Acts that was in collaboration with the Morton Arboretum in Chicago. And there was a number of trees highlighted that were endangered globally. So we were able to put the plaques in front of some trees that we had in our collections, but some of them don't grow this far north in Ontario. Our climate's a little bit colder. So we actually brought in that monkey puzzle and we temporarily installed it in our World Trees collection beside the plaque. And after a while, I thought, well, you know what, we can bring it out every year and give people a chance to see it. And we do that. We bring it into our greenhouse over the winter. But it is a really neat tree, and it is remarkably cold hardy, just not quite cold hardy enough. But in their native environment, they're high elevation in the mountains of Chile, in southern Chile, where it snows and they get frost, so they can definitely handle some. But when it kind of pushes past minus 15 or 20 in our winters here, that's a little bit too much for them.
Yeah, and we will be, so that little area, we often have quite a few sort of ancient plants. And we are actually in the process of designing a sign series that will be talking and highlighting those plants as well. So stay tuned for that at some point in the future.
I'm not seeing any more questions in our chat. So I can give you guys a couple more minutes. If you have something that you're thinking about asking, definitely do ask it. The question just came in, is the Arboretum Center open?
So the Arboretum Center is not open to the public yet, but we are getting closer. So that will be something that we're hoping will happen in the not too distant future. Probably we are going to be able to start having meetings and smaller groups together, but currently right now, as far as I know, I was away last week, so maybe something changed. But as far as I know, the Arboretum Center is still closed, but we are hoping to have it open soon.
And do our pawpaw trees have fruit right now?
They are developing fruit, though the one thing we always remind our visitors is that the Arboretum has a non-consumptive policy. So we like to leave the fruit in place, because sometimes it's important for people to be able to see it. And we've had some instances where you know, I think very excited people want to taste a pawpaw and they come harvest all the pawpaws. And obviously for workshops and identification courses, without the fruit, it's one less thing to show. But we also like to leave things for wildlife as well. And there are occasions where we want to be able to harvest the seeds for conservation projects. So it's important for us to be able to access these seeds. We send them out to for example, the National Tree Seed Center for long-term conservation. So yes, there are little pawpaw fruits developing on our pawpaw trees. If you ever want to sample some though, what you would need to do is go through the process of applying for a user request form permit to be able to obtain some of those things. But please enjoy viewing them by all means. And it is something that, luckily enough now, even in Southern Ontario, they are starting to show up in the odd farmers market, especially, you know, a little bit southwest of Guelph. So it's a chance, if you're on a weekend in the right spot, you might be able to buy a little basket of them this September.
Someone in the chat wrote, I recently started a hobby business specializing in native and unusual plants. Does the Arboretum accept any giveaway plants?
Yeah, occasionally, yes. So we're pretty specific with what we like to install into our collections. From a curatorial standpoint, we like to take very careful observations of where things are collected from, and specifically where we want to collect from to put into our collections. We have had a plant sale at our Arboretum Expo for many years, and obviously the last few years things have been a little bit different, and we're still not sure what it looks like now. But there are cases where we're very happy to accept donations of things that that kind of fit within what we typically like to distribute to the public as well, that we're always very grateful for. So what I would say to that is certainly, if you do have extra things, feel free to reach out to us at arbor@uofguelph.ca and let us know if there's things that you're trying to save from the compost pile. There's some cases where we can definitely accept it, and other cases where we might not, but we're very grateful and appreciative for the offers in any case.
We have a bit of a longer question in the chat, so I'll read it off. We have a much loved northern cantaloupe tree, which we raised from seed. 2 weeks ago, we found one lower branch has all of its leaves wilted, turned brown, and some subsequently fell. Since that occurrence, this problem has spread rapidly to 1/3 of the tree. After some research, it is likely to be vermiculite wilt. What are the prospects for survival of this tree? What specific treatments are recommended? Should affected branches be removed now or wait till next season? Finally, when sawing off branches, does the particular from sawing contain vermiculite fungus?
Yeah, so it's verticillium wilt is the typical it's a very aggressive fungus that can impact a lot of different trees. And it is something that's really hard to control. Once it's in the tree, there's no kind of silver bullet remedy that you can give it. So it is kind of cultural control. That's the best thing you can do. And that is typically trying to remove some of the infected branches far enough back that you're getting to healthy tissue, but also being very careful to sterilize your cutting tools between every cut so that you're not spreading it further. And then also trying to keep it as stress-free as possible. So I would say this year, keeping it well watered, which doesn't seem like it's a huge problem because of the rains we've been getting lately. But last year, we did have some droughty periods, and sometimes these things are caused from stress in previous years. So trees are very finicky about not showing what's bothering them sometimes till a few years later. So right now, I would say, Mother Nature's helping certainly with the rains, but try to keep it stress-free if we do hit droughty periods. But the best advice I could give right now is that obviously making a diagnosis, very well could be verticillium wilt based upon what you're seeing, but without actually physically seeing it, I wouldn't want to make that specific diagnosis. So actually having a certified arborist come in and take a look, evaluate it, and then make recommendations for pruning and things like that can be very helpful. The other thing you can do is take a sample from parts of the infected branches or leaves, and you can send that to Laboratory Diagnostic Services here at the University of Guelph. So you can just Google that, Lab Services, University of Guelph, and they do have a process where homeowners and farmers and people who have nurseries and can send disease samples to be verified as far as what they're seeing. And that's the most important thing is how you treat something. You need to know what you're dealing with first, and it very well could be verticillium wilt, but if you want to absolutely make sure of that, that's something you can do as well. If you do have a certified arborist come in to look at your tree, that's something that they can also do for you, is get that stuff sent off for testing.
Another question coming in is, if my pawpaw matures, would you like the seeds?
Likely not in the case of what you've got, because we're very, very strict. I know it sounds where we've got these standards, but all the pawpaws in the Arboretum, we know exactly where they came from in the wild from Ontario, and we're very careful about making sure that we're maintaining those Ontario genetics. And in cases where, if it's a cultivated tree in someone's garden, it could have originated in Ontario, but it also could have originated from Virginia historically through the nursery process. So as exciting as it is for me, who loves seeds and constantly gathers them, I always love more seeds, but for the purposes of what we would actually be putting into our collections from a conservation standpoint, we typically have to control that a little bit more. So thank you. Really grateful for it. I know you'll be able to find someone who would love to have those seeds though. Absolutely. High demand right now for pawpaws.
And what is the coolest wildlife you've seen at the Arboretum?
Oh gosh, so many great things at the Arboretum. I don't know, one of my favorite observations. So when I'm in the office, which I'm not right now, my office is in the Arboretum Center, which is sunk into the ground. And so I have a little circular window that's right at ground level. And while I was talking to our administrative assistant at the time, who was looking at me and the window was behind me, she said, "Oh, a weasel just went past your window." And I said, "Which way?" And so we ran up to the sunroom because that was the direction the weasel was heading. And it was a male long-tailed weasel, which went by carrying a deer mouse in its mouth. And so it was really neat because we have two kinds of weasels that regularly occur in the Arboretum: short-tailed weasel, or ermine, and the long-tailed weasel. And they're really hard to tell apart, but the males are much bigger than the females, and long-tailed weasels are bigger than short-tailed weasels. And this one was so huge, it was like a really, really big weasel, that it was a male long-tailed weasel. And so it was neat to be able to get, because of course it couldn't see us through the glass, so I was only this far away from it, to get such a great look at a weasel, because we don't tend to get really good looks at those. So that's one of my favorite Arboretum wildlife sightings.
A question from Facebook is, how often do you find species that are new to the Arboretum? Is it that they are already there and just haven't been discovered yet? Or is there just a time when they make their way over to a new habitat?
So we get both. So, so for example, we've recorded over 800 moth species in the Arboretum, and a lot of those species are, have been there forever. We just have never actually found one because, there's just so many different moths, and some of them are really hard to identify. But then we get some volunteers that are really interested in moths, and they spend time at our night sheets where we put a black light on them that attracts moths, and that increases the number of moth species that we have. So that's sort of in agreement with the start of that question. But also we sometimes have populations that move around. So giving a moth example again, I've been at the Arboretum for I'm in my 29th year, and we've never had Promethea moths recorded in the Arboretum in all that time. And then in the last few years, we've had quite a few records of Promethea moth. So even though they were found in the area, we just had never really found them in the Arboretum, and they're pretty conspicuous. So if they were here consistently before, we probably would have come across them. But yeah, just the last few years, we've had a lot more records of those. Plus other species, their ranges change, and then they show up in the Arboretum. So for the first maybe 15 years that I worked here, we never had a red-bellied woodpecker in the Arboretum. And then their range sort of expanded north. And yeah, now we have them. They're a regular woodpecker that we have here. They breed here, and we see them, like we could actually go out and probably find a red-bellied woodpecker, which would have been unheard of in the late 80s, early 90s. So yeah, so things definitely change. But things like that can also change the other way. So species that we used to have are no longer here. So before I started at the Arboretum, Alan Watson, who was the director and then the interpretive biologist, there used to be snowshoe hares in the Arboretum, and now there aren't any snowshoe hares in the Arboretum. When I started working at the Arboretum, we had European hares in the Arboretum, and the habitats have changed and their ranges have changed, and now we don't have any European hares in the Arboretum. So yeah, so lots of changes that way that sort of go up and down depending on the species that you're talking about.
And what USDA zone do you consider the Arboretum?
Well, yeah, so the USDA kind of plant hardiness zone, I guess if we're going officially by the maps, typically we're considered a 6A for Canadian zones. And the shift usually to US is going one down. So we would be considered a USDA 5A. Now, that all being said, plant hardiness zones are so fluid based upon microhabitat and climate and whether a plant's facing north or facing south on a building. So we typically, if I'm looking at a plant resource guide, for example, that's using a USDA seed zone, I will feel pretty confident with anything USDA 5 as being hardy here. And for the most part, 6 as well. I think we can always find stuff, if it's something we really want to grow here, if we can find the right situation and protect it for the first years, usually we can establish plants in zone 6. USDA zone 7 is really pushing it for us. So we've had some success with Canadian zone 7 and certainly most of Canadian zone 6, but that's USDA zone 7 is pushing a little bit. So I know that might sound confusing. If you're reading a book, you'll see Canadian zones and US zones, and usually a 5 means a 6 or vice versa, depending if it's US or Canada. I feel like we should just sync them up. It makes it a little bit easier, but yeah, roughly speaking, 6 is safe, 7's pushing it, 5 is really safe. So.
Awesome. And it looks like those are all the questions in the chat. So if everyone feels like their questions have been answered and you don't have anything else any more burning nature questions, we can wrap it up here and I can let you guys all enjoy the rest of your day. You can look forward to another one of these events next month. So if you really enjoyed coming here and getting your questions answered, we enjoy answering the questions. So definitely look out for another one of those events. And one last question that I can see coming in, if you have more questions, feel free to pop them in. But another question I see coming in the chat is, while visiting many parks throughout the city, I've seen 8 newly planted red oak trees that all have their leaves afflicted by large patches of dry, dead brown leaf. What is happening here? Will the trees survive?
It sounds like that's likely some transplant stress. Now, depending on where the brown is, that can make all the difference. So if you're seeing the brown kind of more so on the edges of leaves, so if you call it necrotic tissue, that can be a stress result. And certainly newly transplanted trees are always under stress, no matter how much we take care of them. If you see brown patches of dead tissue kind of between veins or different spots of leaf, that can be other problems. Sometimes it can be nutrient deficiencies or nutrient toxicities. And there's also different bacteria that can cause those kind of spots that will cause some brown spotting as well. But certainly with newly planted trees, they're all a little bit more susceptible to those environmental stresses and those kind of pest and disease stresses that come along with it. But trees are also pretty resilient too. So I think definitely as far as whether they'll survive or not, we'll know that they're out of the woods or creating their own woods and forest, I guess, in the future. Once they have that chance to kind of get through their first winter, get their feet set and see how they leaf out next year. And often some of those initial things you'll see on newly planted trees will disappear as they get their feet set and the roots really do a better job of supporting the tree.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for all of your questions. Thank you for joining us. And I will let you guys go on with your day. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.